As you are able, I'll invite you to stand as we sing together the Gospel Acclamation. The Holy Gospel according to John, the 11th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
I will invite you to be seated because we have a long gospel reading this morning. A certain man, Lazarus, was ill. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This was the Mary who anointed the Lord with fragrant oil and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent word to Jesus saying, "Lord, the one whom you love is ill." When he heard this, Jesus said, "This illness isn't fatal. It's for the glory of God, so that God's Son can be glorified through it." Jesus loved Martha, her sister, and Lazarus. When he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed where he was. And after 2 days, he said to his disciples, "Let's return to Judea again." The disciples replied, "Rabbi, the Jewish opposition wants to stone you, but you want to go back?" Jesus answered, "Aren't there 12 hours in the day? Whoever walks in the day doesn't stumble because they see the light of the world. But whoever walks in the night does stumble because the light isn't in them." He continued, "Our friend Lazarus is sleeping, but I'm going in order to wake him up." The disciples said, "Lord, if he's sleeping, he'll get well." They thought Jesus meant that Lazarus was in a deep sleep, but Jesus had spoken about Lazarus' death. Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus has died. For your sakes, I'm glad I wasn't there, so that you can believe. Let's go to him." Then Thomas, the one called Didymus, said to the other disciples, "Let us go too, so that we may die with Jesus." When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was a little less than 2 miles from Jerusalem. Many people had come to comfort Martha and Mary after their brother's death. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him, while Mary remained in the house. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died. And even now I know that whatever you ask God, God will give you." Jesus told her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha replied, "I know that he'll rise in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me will live even though they die. Everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She replied, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, God's Son, the one who is coming into the world." After she said this, she went and spoke privately to her sister Mary. "The teacher is here, and he's calling for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to Jesus. He hadn't entered the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. When the people who were comforting Mary in the house saw her get up quickly and leave, they followed her. They assumed she was going to mourn at the tomb. When Mary arrived where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died." When Jesus saw her crying and the people who had come with her crying also, he was deeply disturbed and troubled. He asked, "Where have you laid him?" And they replied, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to cry. And the people said, "See how much he loved him." But some of them said, "He healed the eyes of the man born blind. Couldn't he have kept Lazarus from dying?" Jesus was deeply disturbed again when they came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone covered the entrance. Jesus said, "Remove the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said, "Lord, the smell will be awful. He's been dead 4 days." Jesus replied, "Didn't I tell you that if you believe, you will see God's glory?" So they removed the stone. Jesus looked up and said, "Father, thank you for hearing me. I know you always hear me. I say this for the benefit of the crowd standing here so that they will believe that you sent me." Having said this, Jesus shouted with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" The dead man came out, his feet bound and his hands tied, and his face covered with a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Untie him and let him go." Therefore, many of the people who came with Mary and saw what Jesus did believed in him. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
So, it's not hard to understand why this story is one that would lead us to a theme today of blessed are those who mourn. This is a very moving story, and it's one that I think many of us can relate to, at least the first part of this story, right? We know the pain that accompanies the death of someone who is dear to us, someone dear as Lazarus was to his sisters, as he was to Jesus as a good friend. Many of us know that upheaval and that sense of being unmoored, that giant gap that this person's absence now leaves in our life. This is a kind of loss that we will all experience in life, but it's certainly not the only kind of loss that we face in life. In her reflections on this story, Kate Bowler offers a list of types of losses that help get at the breadth that this category includes, the kinds of things that we might have already encountered or may encounter in the future in our lives. And I thought it was a really helpful list, so I wanted to share that with you. It includes things like dreams that may never become a reality, children we will never have, or perhaps a childhood that was so traumatic that we never got to be a kid. Some grieve that their own child lost their sense of innocence because of a terrible situation. Others grieve the deaths of loved ones gone too soon, or when time will just never, ever be enough. We grieve our beloved pets and the loss of bodies that stop working like they used to. We grieve for careers or cities or homes that we have to say goodbye to. We mourn the reality of broken relationships, of breakups, divorces, friendships that end. Difficult family members who could never understand or apologize. We grieve for people in our communities or around the world who face natural disasters or the consequences of hatred, violence, and war. We grieve for our planet, groaning under the weight of a climate crisis. Now, this is a pretty comprehensive list, and I'm sure that together we could add many more things to it, because losses, whether they are small or big, they are a part of what it is to be human, and each one of us has our own list of losses that we've experienced in life. The story of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead has, for a long time, been one of my very favorite stories in the whole Bible. And if I was pressed to choose one favorite one, this is what I would choose. And for me, there are two things that make this story very special. And the first is, as I talked about in the children's time, that verse where it tells us that Jesus began to cry, that Jesus wept, right? And it's interesting because we know that even Jesus acknowledges It didn't have to happen that way, but it did, and he experiences that grief, right? Jesus weeps with Mary and with Martha, and because of that, I feel like we can trust that Jesus weeps with us when we're facing loss, when we're facing death, right? Often there's that question asked, where is God when something terrible happens? And it's not a question that I think we have adequate answers to in this life, but a partial answer that always brings me hope and comfort is that promise that when I am weeping, that God is weeping with me, that God is holding me and is with me in that moment. It also makes me think, right, that if Jesus can cry, then our tears are okay too, right? Our tears are healthy, they're normal. It's okay to have those deep feelings when life hasn't turned out the way we had expected or the way that we had hoped it would. It tells us that when we face loss, there is room for every big, dark, deep emotion, sadness, anger, disappointment, shame, and that even there's room for things like gratitude and love, which can make all of this feel complicated too, but that's the way grief is. Grief is complicated, and sometimes it's all of these things wrapped up together. It's not just one thing. The second reason that I find this story so meaningful is, of course, the ending, right? That Jesus doesn't let Lazarus stay dead. Jesus raises him back to life. And to be clear, this is a point that is both comforting but also challenging, right? And it's challenging, that's what I already said, right? We could have a good debate about why did Jesus not come earlier, right? He didn't have to let Lazarus die in the first place. And he's challenged on this. The disciples challenge him, Martha and Mary challenge him. And I think it's an important question to ask, to push back on God, right? Why do these things have to happen? I think that's a fair question. I think God can handle that question too, even if we may not get an answer that satisfies us in this life. Because we know in the story, if anyone could have done anything to prevent this grief from happening, it was Jesus. So it's challenging to understand why. Why didn't he come sooner? The other part that's challenging, and I mean, Jesus does give his explanation, right? The reason he didn't come sooner is because he wanted to reveal God's glory through raising Lazarus from the dead. And that's good in Lazarus's case. Maybe doesn't help us out so much because we don't usually get to experience resurrection in our lives in this same way. Certainly not having our deceased loved ones raised back to life, right? With the exception perhaps of some who do have near-death experiences. The resurrection of the dead is not something that happens in our life. And we can, I think, and we often do, right? We come through grief to find new life on the other side of a loss. But whatever life, new life we find, it doesn't cancel out the pain of the grief, right? And I think that pain is always with us, right? One of the best ways to talk about that is I like how people talk about the grief never goes away, right? We just kind of figure out how to build around it, to shape our lives around it. But it becomes part of our story that never goes away. So there's certainly challenge for us, I think, in the story when it comes to how it ends for Lazarus and how it often doesn't end for us. But that's not the end of the story either. There's hope and promise and comfort for us too. Because we are on the cusp of Holy Week, and it's foreshadowed in this story, right? Jesus is closer to Jerusalem again, and they've kind of talked about that this is dangerous for you to do. Are you really sure you want to go back to Jerusalem? We're on the cusp of this Holy Week, right? We will journey with Jesus to the cross next week. Jesus will humble himself by becoming obedient to death, dying on a cross. And in 2 weeks, on Easter morning, we will celebrate the foolish and beautiful promise of the Christian faith, that God doesn't let Jesus stay dead either. And that is the core promise and the hope of our faith, that God is always at work in death, creating life. And that's why we dare to say, that we dare to live in the face of pain and loss with hope, that we live with hope. For we know that through Jesus' own death, the sting of death on earth will be defeated once and for all. Blessed are we who mourn, because God is with us, holding us close and weeping with us in the face of loss. And blessed are we who mourn, because God does not ever, ever let death get the final word. Amen. Our hymn of the day is number 773, Precious Lord, Take My Hand, and I'll invite you to stand as you are able as we sing together.